On the 17th of January 1961, Patrice Lumumba, the first Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of Congo, was assassinated. Described as one of the most significant assassinations in modern African history, this heinous crime is widely believed to have been the fruit of two interrelated conspiracies which were led by the US and Belgian governments. To truly appreciate the historical importance of Lumumba's death, it is important to understand three things. 1. The global context in which the assassination took place. 2. Lumumba's status as a revolutionary nationalist leader. And 3. The long-term impact of his death on Congolese politics. From the late 1800s to the early 1990s, the US and Belgium were arguably two of the most important external forces in the shaping of Congo's destiny. From as early as 7 months before the infamous Berlin Conference of 1884, in which European powers gathered to divide and allocate various African regions to themselves, the US was the first world power to formally recognize the ownership claims made by Belgium's King Leopold II to the territories of the Congo Basin. In 1885, King Leopold established what was then known as the Congo Free State, which he would rule in his own personal capacity, completely separate from his role as the constitutional head of the Belgian government. King Leopold and his men would go on to brutally exploit the people of the so-called Congo Free State and commit all kinds of atrocities in their bid to profit from the region's natural resources. Putting in place a system of forced labor all across the territory, King Leopold would unleash a reign of terror in which rape, mutilations, and mass killings became the order of the day. Although scholars disagree on the exact figures, the most commonly cited death tolls range from between 5 to 10 million deaths during the 21 years that the Congo Free State was ruled by King Leopold. By way of comparison, the total death toll of the Nazi Holocaust was between 6 to 11 million, but for various reasons, the atrocities of King Leopold in the Congo Free State are nowhere near as well known. Reacting to the public outcry following the revelations of King Leopold's atrocities in Congo, the US joined other world powers in calling for the Belgian government to seize control of the Congo Free State and turn it into a Belgian colony. Belgium eventually took colonial control of Congo in 1908 and would rule the country until its independence in 1960. During the colonial period, the US acquired a very significant stake in the vast natural wealth of the Congo and is believed to have used uranium sourced from Congolese mines to manufacture the atomic bombs that were dropped in the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II. With the outbreak of the Cold War shortly after World War II, which saw the US and its allies square up to the fast-growing Soviet Union and its anti-capitalist agenda, the Western powers could not afford to allow the Soviet Union to gain access to strategic raw materials such as those found in the Congo and other African countries. From a US perspective, there could not have been a more risky time for African nations to gain independence than the late 1950s and 60s. With the Cold War in full swing, and the host of African leaders expressing their approval for Soviet-style economics, the US government needed to act fast and decisively in order to protect its global interests. And it is for this very reason that Patrice Lumumba's push in the late 1950s for Congo to gain genuine independence and sovereign control of its resources placed him in direct opposition to Western interests. Shortly after his election as the first Prime Minister of the newly independent Congo, he was faced with an army revolt, and secessionist rebel groups from Congo's mineral-rich provinces began to wreak havoc on the country. Belgium sent in troops supposedly to protect Belgian nationals living in the Congo, but it was widely believed that the Belgian troops were actually working to strengthen the rebels. Lumumba appealed to the United Nations to expel the Belgians and deploy UN peacekeeping troops to help repress the rebels. But with the United Nations unwilling to act quickly to help suppress the rebels, Lumumba appealed to the Soviet Union for military equipment to assist his troops in their fight to restore internal order. This move would set the Western powers into panic mode, and the CIA, MI6, and Belgian security operatives would all allegedly begin plotting to bring an end to his premiership. In their bid to get rid of him and all that he stood for, the American and Belgian governments are believed to have conspired to deploy all the tools and resources at their disposal, including the United Nations Secretariat under Dag Hammarskjöld and Ralph Bunche, to buy the support of Lumumba's Congolese rivals. Within just under 7 months after the country gained independence from Belgium and his appointment as the country's first Prime Minister, Patrice Lumumba was seized and executed by Belgian and Congolese operatives of the newly installed military government led by the infamous Mobutu Sese Seko, a government whose entry into power is believed to have been backed by the US and Belgian governments, acting in collaboration with key UN officials. The execution was swift but brutal. Lumumba, along with two of his associates, Maurice Umpolo, and Joseph Okito, were lined up against a tree and shot one at a time. The execution is believed to have taken place on the 17th of January 1961 at around 9:40 p.m. The full details of how the bodies were disposed of are simply too shocking to be described in this video. With Lumumba eliminated, the Mobutu regime would go on to pay nothing more than lip service to the ideals of national unity, economic independence, and Pan-African solidarity, which have been championed by Lumumba, shattering the hopes and aspirations of the millions of Congolese who had placed their faith in the great leader. The assassination was against the backdrop of great political turmoil, as the country was greatly divided, with 4 separate governments, all laying claim to legitimate control of the territory. The first was the central government in Kinshasa, which was then called Leopoldville. The second was a rival central government, led by Lumumba's followers in Kisangani, formerly known as Stanleyville, while the third and fourth were led by secessionist leaders hailing from the mineral-rich provinces of Katanga and South Kasai. As the physical elimination of Lumumba had removed what Western powers saw as the major threat to their interests in the Congo, they subsequently directed their energies towards restoring and growing the authority of the pro-Western regime in Kinshasa over the entire country, and effectively snuffed out the Lumumba-inspired rival Kisangani government in August 1961. The other 2 rival governments would also subsequently be snuffed out. The South Kasai regime was disbanded in 1962, while the Katanga secessionist group was suppressed in January 1963. With the unrivaled support of his Western allies, the Mobutu regime would go on to rule Congo with an iron fist for over 3 decades, unleashing an almost unrivaled reign of corruption, terror, and financial mismanagement that would plague the country for years to come. Due to his relatively short political career, the full impact of Lumumba's legacy could be rather hard to fully quantify. His death in 1961 was seen as a huge blow to African nationalist movements at the time, but it ultimately fanned the fire amongst other African revolutionaries to continue in their fight against imperialism. Numerous historians have also cited his death as a major contributing factor to the radicalization of the American civil rights movement in the 1960s. And even till today, Patrice Lumumba continues to be revered as a symbolic representation of the Pan-African struggle for liberation, and his ideas have been canonized in a political ideology known as Lumumbism, a complex doctrine which can be best described as a combination of nationalism, Pan-Africanism, and social progressivism. His life may have been brutally cut short, but his spirit certainly lives on.
The assassination of Lumumba was something that was felt by many people to be a sort of pivotal turning point in the saga of Africa gaining its independence. In the 1950s, there were movements for independence all over Africa. There was a great deal of idealism in the air. There was a great deal of hope in the air, both among Africans and among their supporters in the United States and Europe, that at last these colonies would become independent. And I think people imagined real independence, that is, that these countries would be able to set off on their own and control their own destiny economically as well as politically. And the assassination of Lumumba really signaled that that was not to be. Because for Belgium, as for the other major European colonial powers like Britain and France, giving independence to an African colony was okay for them as long as it didn't disturb existing business arrangements, as long as the European country could continue to own the mines, the factories, the plantations. Well, okay, let them have their politics. But Lumumba spoke very loudly, very dramatically, saying Africa needs to be economically independent as well. And it was a fiery speech on this subject that he gave at the actual independence ceremonies, June 30th, 1960, where he was replying to an extremely arrogant speech by King Baudouin of Belgium. It was a speech he gave on this subject that I think really began the process that ended 2 months later with the CIA, with White House approval, decreeing that he should be assassinated.
And, of course, for most Americans who were not perhaps as familiar with African colonialism, since that was basically a European project throughout the 19th century, the role of Belgium and the importance of the Congo as really the jewel of Africa in terms of its wealth and resources, how did the Congo suffer before Lumumba came to power?
Well, the story really begins in the modern era in 1885, or 1884 to 85, when all the major countries of Europe, preceded by the United States, actually, we were the very first, recognized the Congo not as a Belgian colony, but as the private, personally owned colony of King Leopold II of Belgium. A very greedy, ambitious man who wanted a colony of his own. At that point, Belgium was not sure that it wanted a colony. Leopold ruled this place for 23 years, made an enormous fortune, estimated at over $1 billion in today's American dollars. Finally, in 1908, he was forced to give it up to become a Belgian colony, and then he died the following year. And the Belgians ran it for the next half century, extracting an enormous amount of wealth, initially in ivory and rubber, then in diamonds, gold, copper, timber, palm oil, all sorts of other minerals. And as with almost all the European colonies in Africa, this wealth flowed back to Europe. It benefited the Europeans much more than the Africans. And the hope that many people had when independence came all over Africa, for the most part, within a few years on either side of 1960, people had the hope that at last African countries would begin to control their own destiny, and they would be the ones who would reap the profits from the mines and the plantations and so on. Lumumba put that hope into words, and for that reason he was immediately considered a very dangerous figure by the United States and Belgium. The CIA issued this assassination order with White House approval, and as was said at the beginning, they couldn't get enough to him to actually poison him, but they got money under the table to Congolese politicians who did see that he was assassinated. With Belgian help, it was a Belgian pilot who flew the plane to where he was killed, a Belgian officer who commanded the firing squad. And then the really disastrous thing that followed was this enthusiastic United States backing for the dictatorial regime of Mobutu, who seized total power a couple of years later and ran a 32-year dictatorship, enriched himself by about $4 billion, and really ran his country into the ground, was greeted by every American president, with the sole exception of Jimmy Carter, who was in office during those 32 years. And he left the country a wreck from which it has still not recovered.
Adam Hochschild, I want to play a clip of the former CIA agent John Stockwell talking about the CIA's plans to assassinate the Prime Minister of the Congo, Patrice Lumumba.
The CIA had developed a program to assassinate Lumumba under Devlin's encouragement and management. The program they developed, the operation didn't work. They didn't follow through on it. It was to give poison to Lumumba, and they couldn't find a setting in which to get the poison to him successfully in a way that it wouldn't appear to be a CIA operation. I mean, you couldn't invite him to a cocktail party and give him a drink and have him die a short time later, obviously. And so they gave up on it. They got cold feet. And instead, they handled it by the chief of station talking to Mobutu about the threat that Lumumba posed, and Mobutu going out and killing Lumumba, having his men kill Lumumba.
What about the CIA's relationship with Mobutu? Were they paying him money?
Yes, indeed. I was there in 1968 when the chief of station told the story about having been, the day before, that day, having gone to make a payment to Mobutu of cash, $25,000, and Mobutu saying, "Keep the money. I don't need it." And by then, of course, Mobutu's European bank account was so huge that $25,000 was nothing to him.
I was there. I was just a college student at the time, and I wish I could say that I was smart and politically knowledgeable enough to realize the full significance of everything I was seeing. I was not, and it was really only in later years that I began to understand it. But what I do remember, and this was, as I say, 6 months or so after he was killed, was the sort of ominous atmosphere in Leopoldville, as the capital was called then. these jeeps full of soldiers who were patrolling the streets, the way the streets quickly emptied at dusk, and then two very, very arrogant guys at the American embassy who were proudly talking over drinks one evening about how this person, Lumumba, had been killed, whom they regarded, not as a democratically elected African leader, but as an enemy of the United States. And so, of course, I, as a fellow American, they expected to be happy that he'd been done away with. There was something quite chilling about that, and it stuck with me, but I think it's only in much later years that I fully realized the significance.